Hello, everyone. I'm starting to see people trickle in. I'm just going to give everybody just a few more minutes to join before we kick things off. So for everyone that's already here, welcome, and we'll be starting in just a few moments. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the questions or chat box. And, as Boris presents, I'll be able to monitor that throughout the presentation. So any questions, comments, feel free to drop those. We'll be starting in just a minute here. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Boris, RPM competency lead at PriceFx, will deliver today's presentation on PriceFx project methodology based on the 100+ implementations we have over our long history. The information today will be extremely helpful for our partners in a variety of ways. And just to let you know, a recording of this webinar will be shared with you shortly after, as well as to be available in the Managed PriceFx community portal for later viewing, as well as for all of your colleagues who are unable to attend, just so that they don't miss out on the information. We'll end today's session with a nice Q&A, and thanks to those partners who've already submitted their questions, we'll be sure to touch on those. And before I pass it over to Boris to kick things off, we wanted to ask some poll questions just to gauge, the partners' interest as well as their, knowledge around the topics that we'll be covering today. So we're going to kick off with five short, brief poll questions, and then we'll pass it over to Boris to begin. For the first poll question, are you familiar with Agile and how to approach a project using Agile methodology? I'll give everybody about 20 to 30 seconds, and then we'll close that poll and move on to the next. So if you see it, please give it an answer in the next 10 to 15 seconds. Great, starting to see a lot of responses, overwhelmingly on the yes side, which is great. All right, I'm gonna close this poll out and then let's share the results. So for those of you who are familiar, we had 73% say yes. And Boris, I'm not sure if you're seeing these results, but I'll speak them out loud. And we have 18% that are not familiar and 9% who are unsure based on Agile methodology. Great, thank you for sharing that, everybody. We're gonna pass it over to the next question. For those of you who said yes, do you use Agile? And if so, purely, is that your only approach to projects, Agile, or are there other approaches that you use? Please answer now. I'll give it another 10 to 15 seconds for our partners to answer. And yes, these are real-time results. Everyone that is here is answering these polls. I just got a question. Thank you for answering. This is just inside this group right now. So I'm going to close this poll out. Let's share those results. So for those of you who purely use Agile, we had 22%, 78% said yes, they do, but it also depends on the project. So I'm guessing, here and there. Great, thank you. Just a few more questions, and this is super helpful for us. The third one, have you implemented a pricing project before? I know some of our partners are quite new. Some of them have been with us for some time. So totally fine if you haven't yet. This is just to help us engage with you in terms of what information you need. So Feel free to answer that. I'll give it about 10 to 15 more seconds. Some really good responses. Awesome. Everybody, just a few more seconds on that. Perfect. So out of the participants that are here right now, 80% of you have implemented a pricing project, with only 20% have not yet. That's really great. And for that 20% that haven't, we'll do our job well enough to make sure you're ready to do one when the time comes. Just 2 more polls. And then here's the 4th. Are you aware of our expert services partner packages? I know some of our channel managers have briefly touched on this with partners. This is a really exciting, extremely valuable initiative. So we're just curious, how much you've heard about it. If so, I'll give that about 10, 15 more seconds, and then we'll read those results. Closing the poll now. Let's see. 64% of our partners that are here right now said yes, they have, and 36% have not. So for that 36%, stay tuned later when Boris touches that. Some really exciting stuff and really valuable for our partners to know about. Last poll, everybody, before I pass it over to Boris. Are any of your customers capable of delivering clean data on the first try? I'm going to say most likely no, but I'm curious to see what all of our attendees have to say. I know this is kind of, ambiguous, but just curious what our partners have to say. Seems like no one said yes yet, and that's kind of where I was thinking this would go. I'll give it about 10 more seconds just for a few more people to answer if they can. All right, let's see what those results are. 69% said no, 31% depends on the size and industry of the partner, or the customer, I'm sorry, and 0% said yes. So very telling result. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the attendees answering all of those questions. Excited to pass it over to Boris, who's going to kick off our PriceFx project methodology webinar today. Thank you, Boris.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. And the results of the polls are very, very helpful for me to tune the presentation a little bit on your needs. No surprises in there. But I will certainly tell something about expert services, also dive then a little bit more into Agile because some are not familiar with that. And I'm also happy to hear that we're not the only company having issues with customers delivering data. So thank you very much for all those results. So my name is Boris Dingenhouts. As Matt said, I'm the competency lead for our project management team. One of the things in my role that I'm responsible for is our project methodology, and that's the topic of today. So if you can see then the second slide, I have 2 main topics here. So first we will talk a little bit in general about Agile versus Waterfall, and then we will zoom into our PriceFx project methodology. So first of all then a very short overview of Agile versus Waterfall, what in our perception the main difference is and the main benefit. So basically in a traditional approach, what we then call Waterfall, we first have a phase where we do analysis. It can be business analysis, data analysis, requirements analysis. Then we design a system. Then we start configuring the system, and then we start testing the system together with the users. And that has some advantages, but also a lot of disadvantages. So one of the things is that if you run out of time at the end, then typically it goes at the expense of testing. So then often you go live with a system that's not properly tested. And also if you look at the cost of change, if you during testing find out that you need to change something for whatever reason that might be, then again you need to go back to analysis, design, code, and test. And that might be very time consuming, and it might put your timeline at risk, because if you find those things out at the very end, you have little time to fix them. So the way Agile is trying to solve that is that basically your slicing and dicing your business requirements into smaller pieces that we then call user stories or epics, and that you do then those phases sequentially for each user story. So you do analysis, design, code, and test, and show you the results to the customer directly, and so that the customer can give you feedback that you can then take into account into the next user story or the next sprint, so that you get a more iterative design and feedbacks you can take into account for the next user stories. And if there are things that are not as the customer expected, then already very early in the process, you can take actions and change a part of the design. And in general, that allows for a lot more flexibility. So the way we typically organize or deliver our projects is in so-called sprints. So those are, let's say, fixed time periods. In our methodology, typically 3 weeks. And to those sprints, we assign user stories where we then do a kind of review. We plan them, we design them, we build them, we test them, and then you can have a kind of product increments going to QA or potentially already going live. And then the learnings you take with you into the next sprint, in the next user stories, and then do the same. So instead of making very large Microsoft project sheets with all kind of dependencies, you slice and dice the requirements differently. You put them in sprints, of course, with some dependencies, but it's much easier to manage your project this way. And you're also much more agile in terms of changing requirements. To put it in another way, in the traditional approach, very typically the features or the scope is fixed. And then the time and cost can be variable, because to implement the scope, if you overlooked some complexities or you have some data issues or some requirements are more complex than you initially estimated, you might need more time and thus more cost. And then also often quality can be at stake, because you might want to deliver things sooner and it goes at the expense of testing. Well, if you look at Agile, then typically the time and the costs are fixed. So you agree with the customer to run a project of an X number of sprints, for example, 4 or 5 sprints. And then you fill up those sprints with user stories. And you make sure that everything you deliver is then always properly tested. And if at the end of the sprints, basically you're done, and that means that some features might be in, some features might not be in. And then it's a matter of prioritization, which is then dictated by the product owner on the customer side to make sure that you work first on the high priority user stories. And then the less important, the could have, should haves, might then move out of scope. So with Agile, you always make sure you have at least a minimum viable product live that's properly tested. Maybe less features, but at least you're within time and you're within budget. So that's in a nutshell what Agile is and how we use Agile and how we can use it into our benefit. However, we don't want to use Agile as a kind of buzzword or hide behind our methodology that we don't deliver something because we hide behind Agile. That's not the way we want to do it. We only use certain elements out of Agile that we think are beneficial for our types of projects. And having said that, I think we need to describe then what we think is special about our type of projects. And I think the first thing is the first bullet over here, that pricing processes in a company are less well described than other processes within a company. So for example, if you would go to one of your customers and ask them, how does your logistical process work like? Or how does your financial processes work like? They can very probably well articulate how they are designed, how they work, who's responsible for what. But in terms of pricing, that's a lot of times very different. So that's partly because pricing is also, as we sometimes say, pricing is an art, but also pricing is very much dependent on local market situations. So the way you do pricing in Germany can be very different than the way you do pricing in France, and let alone on different parts of the world. So that means that the people or the group of people giving you the requirements, they might know how a part of the product portfolio is priced or how a part of the market is priced, but they might not be aware of all details of all markets. So that means that requirements during the project are quite likely to change, and that's what we quite often see. The second reason why we want to build in some flexibility, or at least very short iterative cycles, is because we're using standard software. And that means we have out-of-the-box capabilities, but also some limitations. So if customers come to us and they start with a blank sheet of paper and start describing how a screen should look like, that's not really the way it works, because we are very flexible in terms of our calculation logics, how that should work. But things like screens, to a certain extent, that's pretty rigid, like the header is on top, items are below, etc. So therefore, it always helps if we can show customers pretty early in the process how a price list looks like, how it works, and that you then build on top of that and define user stories on top of that. So those first two items are actually in favor of using Agile, and that's why we use a lot of Agile components. But we tuned our methodology because very often we work with a statement of work in which we described a scope, and some customers want to stick to this agreed scope. So then we cannot freely move functionality in or out. So therefore we cannot use pure Agile. And the last main differentiator is that we did similar projects many times before. So more than 100 times we implemented PriceFx for different customers. So we pretty well know what's coming at us, and we're also pretty good at making estimations in terms of number of man days that it takes to implement a certain piece of functionality. So in Agile, you see a lot of elements like estimations using story points and planning poker. And those elements we don't need because they are solutions to problems that we don't have, because we can make proper estimations. And also our project methodology allows for, so it's not a one size fits all. So it's a kind of best practice guideline, but depending on actual project needs, we can differ with how we execute projects from one customer to another. So some very small projects just involving Price Builder can have a little bit condensed project methodology versus a large program rollout for a very large customer using all modules. But we have some minimum requirements because for certification like SOC 1, we are being audited, so certain elements need always to be in place. So just as an example, customers always need to give us a written approval in some system, typically Jira, that we can move some piece of functionality to production. So regardless of the project size, that needs to be in place. So then how does our methodology look like? So this is actually the most important sheet of this presentation. So this is a complete overview of our methodology. So I will walk you through each and every of these boxes. So basically it starts here on the left-hand top, and that's still actually in the pre-sales phase where we have the project scoping. So what happens in that phase is that our solution sales team goes to the customer. They discuss with the customer their requirements and their desired scope. And then they make what we then call the one-liner user stories, so that at least we know what is coming at us. And those one-liner of user stories, they are then being estimated, and that estimation comes then in the statement of work that the customer then can sign. So that's, in principle, it's a high-level estimate, but based on our experience. So when the customer then signs the statement of work, we can start the project. and then the project initiation phase starts. And the purpose of that phase is to set up the project both on the PriceFx side, and that we also set up the project or help the customer set up the project on his side or her side in terms of things like what kind of people do they need to involve from their side. So how many solution matter experts, how many data experts, that they have sufficient time reserved for IT experts to look at integration, for example, and also end users for doing tests so that the customer is aware what's coming at them and that they have a proper team set up on their side. And internally, what we then do is a handover from a sales team to the project team. So typically those are two different teams. And we set up internally all the systems like the dev and the QA instance. We set up Jira, so that's the system in which we maintain user stories and the sprints, and Confluence, and that's our document management system to which our customers also have access, so where we can store project-specific documentation. Depending on when the customer can really start, this typically takes between 2 to 6 weeks. And then we move to what we call the foundation sprint. And the foundation sprint starts with the kickoff presentation. So that's in let's say normal global circumstances, that's an online, an on-site meeting. So we go with the team to the customer, and then that's the first time that we're all together in one room, and then we present to the complete team the plan in terms of timeline. What is the scope? Who are involved? What will be the meeting cadence that we will have? And after the kickoff meeting, which typically takes like 2 hours, we start with the foundation workshop. And in the foundation workshop, we take as a starting point the one-liner user stories from the pre-sale cycle. And then we start adding all the needed details so that the configuration engineer theoretically would start building the user story or configuring the user story. Once we have all the user stories defined, we re-estimate them again to see that the initial estimate made still is a valid estimate. So it can, for example, happen that customers now start adding much more detail and much more complexity, so that we need to increase the estimate, and then we need to clearly articulate them where this difference comes from. But overall, the estimate should be still the same, and else we need to look at the change order. So the user story part is then, so the functional user story part is then one part of the foundation week. The second part is actually data. So therefore we had a poll question, and I was happy to see that also your customers struggle with delivering proper clean data, complete data in one go, because basically that never happens. So we need to give the customers some time to give some iterations of data before they get up to the point that we can call the data production ready data. But basically there's even one step before that, because before we start any configuration, we want to have already sample data for each data source from the customer. So we really have a rule, like if we don't have sample data for each data table, we don't start the configuration. So that means we don't start with the feature sprints, because we have the experience that we can mock up some data ourselves, and then we configure something that properly works, and then we get the real data, which is then different than we expect, and then we need to rewrite a lot of code. So we make a data delivery plan that then has a couple of components. So one component is make sure we get, before the setup sprint, sample data for each and every data table. And then we give the customer the opportunity to, for example, if you have a 6-sprint project, then we would like to have the first real data drop for example, in the second sprint, then a second data drop in a fourth sprint, and then the final data drop containing production ready data in a sixth sprint. And the reason for that is that before the UAT, so during the UAT, we want to test not only all the functionalities that we implemented, whether they work correctly, but we also want to test whether the data is there correctly, complete, and doing what it should do. And another benefit of having a full data set in the UAT, or even before that, is that you already get a very good idea on the performance of the system. Because also in our experience, if you have a smaller subset of the data, you might not have any performance issue. But once you get a full data set which might be 5 or 10 times bigger than your sample data set, you certainly might run into performance issues. And if you find those during the UAT or even later, then you have a problem. Because within PriceFx, basically we can solve almost any performance issue. We are really very good at scaling, but it always takes some time because we need to extend the machines, we need to look at technical parameters, we need to look at the database, etc. So depending on how long it takes to have all the user stories complete, to have the data delivery plan complete, including the data specification, that drives how long this particular phase takes. And also how long it takes for the customer to deliver a sample data that basically drives the timeline until the setup sprint. So in the setup sprint, what we do there is we create all the inbound data tables, and then we load the sample data that the customer gave us. And this is positioned here so that once this is done, we can start with the first feature sprint. And then in between here, we have what we call the preparation sprint. And in some projects, those smaller projects, those are combined into one phase. In the preparation sprint, what we do there is that's the preparation sprint for feature sprint 1. So there we do the user story grooming. We make sure that the configuration engineer and the QA analyst fully understand all the user stories, that the SA completed fully the design, so that we can start the week after with feature sprint 1. So once we start with the feature sprints, the way we typically do that is we look at, based on the SOW, we have a certain capacity of configuration engineers and integration engineers. And then based on the estimation in the user stories, which are not in story points, but in man days, we can really very accurately assign user stories to sprints and fill up the sprints completely. So if you have a 3-week sprint with one configuration engineer, you know you can assign to that sprint 15 man days worth of user stories, and that should fit within that sprint. So within the feature sprints, what we do there is we configure the user stories, we QA them ourselves, and then we hand them over to the customers to test. So there is either it's then a solution matter expert or an end user on the customer side who's then responsible for testing, and they should then approve the user story in Jira if they think it works as it should. So I'm having a further slide on what we exactly do in feature sprints, what kind of meeting cadence we have. But all delivery happens in the feature sprints. And then at the end of the last feature sprint, then we need to make sure all user stories have been approved. And then we move in the UAT phase. And the UAT phase is, as we always say, it's the customer's responsibility to organize that. So that's, as we say, the customer's party, because they need to test whether they can do their daily job with our system, and that it properly fits in their other processes and their other business systems. So the test should really be end-to-end tests. So during the feature sprints, we call that unit tests, that customers test user stories individually. So whether they meet the acceptance criteria and do what they should do. But in the UAT, we would like to see customers create a new customer in their backend, create a new product, make sure that that customer and that product, that they are being interfaced to PriceFx, that we then can give a list price to the product, that we then can make a quote for the customer, set a discount there, integrate the discount and the list price to their ERP system, make an order, make an invoice, and see that the correct price is on the invoice. So that whole chain, we want customers to test that, and that's not really something that we can do. So we can help them and guide them a little bit, but customers are responsible for that phase. And then at the end of the UAT, we have a formal go, no go. And once we have a go, we go into the cutover sprint. So somewhere during the feature sprints, we make a go live strategy. So basically, we either set up a new instance that we then call production. We do all data loads again and declare that the live production system. But what we also often do is that we make a copy of QA to production, that we then delete some transactional data that we don't need there anymore, and that we declare that the live system. And that's typically a strategy that we use for customers that have very high data volumes, so that we don't need to go through the exercise of the initial data load again. Because for some of our customers, which really have big data volumes, that can take like 2 weeks. So once we're live, we have a stabilization sprint, or that's a kind of hypercare period where the project team is still there, so that when customers have issues or find bugs, that the project team can still pick them up and solve them. And then that's typically a phase of 2 weeks. And then we hand over to the customer success manager, who is then the long-term contract for the customer. Unless we go to a phase 2 of a project, of course, and then still the project team stays intact and goes to the next phase. So that also links a little bit to the number of sprints. So we see typically projects have between 2 and really maximum 8 sprints. So I think the sweet spot is probably somewhere between 3 and 6. So we always recommend, if the number of sprints gets bigger, that you cut the project in phases. So I don't believe a 12 sprints project will really work. Then you can better split it between the modules, and then, for example, in phase 1 go live with Price Builder, then in phase 2 add Quote Configurator, and in phase 3 add Rebate Manager, and not do them all in one big project. That's basically what our recommendation is. So if we then zoom in a bit to the feature sprints, so what do we do in feature sprints? So we after the foundation sprint, we have all the user stories completed, put in the backlog and estimated in terms of man days. And then we have a sprint planning meeting, typically halfway the week before the sprint starts, where we pick user stories from the backlog, assign them to the sprints. And that's the responsibility basically of the product owner on the customer side. So there should be one person deciding on the priorities, what he wants to see first. Of course, taking into account some technical dependencies that we can drive. So then we have typically 3-week sprints, although in some circumstances we make them a little bit shorter. And then we have daily stand-ups. So for very small projects, it's not always daily, but sometimes twice a week. But I think it's very important, because we all work remotely, that at least once per day we get together, the PriceFx team plus the customer team, that they get together in one call for 15 minutes. Typically we go over the Jira board, I have a sheet later on that, how that looks like, and that we go over that to be sure that everybody knows what's expected from him or her that particular day, and that person can also indicate whether there are any impediments or any other issues that he or she is struggling with. Then during the sprints, we deliver user stories. So as you can see here, we have a demo meeting at the end of the sprint, but as soon as we finish testing a user story, we directly deliver it to the customer. So the customer has more time to check it and test it. Because basically, at the end of the 3 weeks, you want everything not only to be delivered from our end, but ideally also tested by the customer. So therefore, it can already be that the first day of a sprint, we deliver a small user story to the customer already to test. But still, we do a demo meeting at the end of the sprint that we typically record. And the purpose of that is to inform the whole team on the customer side what we configured. And customers can use also that recording to build their end user documentation, because end user documentation is typically not something that we build. And then at the end of the sprint, we have a retrospective meeting. That's also a very important meeting, not to be underestimated, what the value of that is. So there, both people from PriceFx and from the customer can indicate what went very well in the sprint and what we should improve for the next sprint. And our experience is that it creates a very open atmosphere, and that people can speak up if they think some elements need improvement. So very often the sprint retrospective of the first sprint, the people are quite silent, but then in the second and third sprint, they speak freely, with the purpose of doing it better next time. This is also an important slide. So we have a principle called clean code. So that means if we do a lot of refactoring of code during the feature sprints. So just as an example, if we would implement 2 rebate types, so let's say rebate type 1 in sprint 1, rebate type 2 in sprint 2, then in sprint 1 the customer tests rebate type 1, then we deliver rebate type 2 in sprint 2, but then we did not make a copy paste of the code of rebate type 1 and then modified it. It could be that we made changes to some underlying routines that are shared by both rebate types, because copy paste of code is not best practice, because that's much harder to maintain, because if you then need to make changes to rebate agreements, you need to do that in multiple places, and if you use routines that are shared, you typically only need to make a change once. But that could mean that we ask the customer in sprint 2 not only to test rebate type 2, but also retest rebate type 1 for regression issues. And that's all with the purpose of having cleaner and easier to maintain code. So a lower total cost of ownership for the customer. So this is also something we always tell the customer. So this slide is about prioritization. So it's very important that in the sprint planning meetings, we always focus first on the must-haves and a little bit less on the should-haves and could-haves, so that in case we, for whatever reason, we run out of time, we at least have all the must-haves delivered and tested. Anything that we need to move in scope that was not there before is either a change request, because then we need additional time, hence additional money, or what happens a lot is that we can move something in as long as we move something out of scope for the same number of man days. So I see this, for example, happening a lot in projects where, for example, you had an X percentage of price analyzer user stories, and then customers want to have changes or additional features in price builder or quote configurator. And then they very often say, well, then we move something new in, and then we move some price analyzer user stories out, because the reports, they can either build it themselves or get it from another system as well. So we are quite flexible in moving things in, as long as we can move something else out. So this is about the type of meetings that we have. So the daily stand-up call we already discussed. So the sprint meetings as well. So the planning meeting, sprint demonstration, and the retrospectives. So on top of that, also important is we always have a weekly call between both PMs, and sometimes the customer success manager is there as well, discussing the progress, the general progress of delivery. So are we delivering the user stories as quickly as we should, and are we ready at the end of the sprint? So that's one, the delivery perspective. And secondly, the budget perspective. So are we burning more or less hours than we planned in each sprint? And we have a tool for that called the budget tracking tool, which is linked to our Jira system, in which we also book our hours. And also in that call, we can discuss general project management issues and things around timeline. And then for some customers, we also invited to the steering committee, but that depends from customer to customer. So basically tools that we're using. Then I would like to emphasize that we try to do as much as possible with Jira. So all communication around user stories in terms of what it should do regarding requirements, regarding data, we would try to avoid to use direct communication like emails or Teams chats, but we would like our users to store that communication in the ticket itself. So Jira has some very nice comments functionality where you can tag users. It sends automatically emails when you get tagged or when you watch a ticket and that get changed. And the benefit of that is that we have it all stored in one place. And if another configuration engineer takes over a user story or if somebody else from our support team looks at the user story, all communication is there in one place. For general communication, we have Confluence, in which we store, for example, kickoff decks or other meeting minutes. So this is a screenshot from Jira. This is a typical board that we're using. So you see here these kind of swim lanes, which represent for one specific sprint the statuses of the tickets. So each block here, so this is just a sample screenshot, but these are user stories that need to be implemented. So each user story has then a business requirement, a kind of technical description, and that can be completed by a configuration engineer, how we exactly implemented it, and acceptance criteria, obviously. So they all start typically in the column to be picked up by PriceFx, because that means those user stories are ready to be configured. If we then still have questions for customers on data or maybe some clarification, we can move them back to be completed by the customer. So if we pick them up and are working on them, we move them to the column in progress PriceFx. If we have any blocker like missing data or whatever, we can move them to this middle column so they really stand out and we need to action on them. If we have tested user stories and think it's time for the customer to test, we move them to ready for testing customer. And then customers can test them. If they approve them, they move them to complete. So this is the board by which we manage the feature sprints. And user stories go from left to right. So in the beginning of the sprint, you will see everything on the left-hand side. Of the end of the sprint, you should see them on the right-hand side. And this board, we go over this every time every day in a daily stand-up. And then typically we start with what's ready for testing by the customer, and is the customer aware of that? Are there any issues? And we can ask, when do you think you're ready testing? So to make sure we have some progress. And the same with all the other tickets on our end. And that means that everybody knows what he or she is doing and what other people are waiting for. And this really allows to work very efficiently and effectively together, even though people are all working remotely or from home. Then in our methodology, we have written down clearly per phase as a reference for our project managers what should be done in each and every phase. We also have all kind of templates, artifacts there. So like a template kickoff deck, a template project status report, a retrospective template, our budget tracking tool, as I explained. We have all kind of documents ready that project managers can use. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of these are also available for you in the partner portal. And if not, we should make them available, but I know a lot of them are there. So
thank you, Boris.
So I think this is basically the last slide. So the only thing I wanted to highlight is what type of roles do we need from the customer side. So it's a project manager, pricing expert, a general product owner. So the project manager is typically from the IT side. The product owner is typically somebody from the business side, making decisions on priorities. And then we have IT and data experts for data integration, end users and testers, and of course the project sponsor paying the money. So basically, I think it's now time for questions. So I hope this made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Boris. That was so clean and detailed, and I hope our partners, receive the real value with that. And like I said, all this will be recorded. So, if you need to revisit this to see certain parts, please do so, and it will be available shortly after. And thanks for all the questions that came in. I was holding off to the end because I believe, some of them might have been already addressed, but we can kick it off with, what specific advantages does PriceFx offer to implement standard configurations for efficient to-be processes versus customer-specific as-is complicated process?
I think that's a very good question. So indeed, customers very often come to us with very complex requirements. And how can we put a standard solution against that, or a simpler solution? And for that, we came up with what we call accelerators. So those are basically, let's say, pre-configured modules based on our experience, what we think is best practice. So we have an accelerator regarding price analyzer that's called Pricing Insights. So there we have the main dashboards that we implement for other customers. So we have them in one place and we can very quickly deploy them. We have a price setting package regarding a price builder on how we see what's best practice now in terms of setting a price list. So how can you assign different strategies to different product groups, and how can that come to life in a price list, for example? We also have a quote configurator, accelerator, a rebate manager accelerator, all with what we consider best practices. And those are not typically the final solution for a customer, but really a very, very good starting point to start your own configuration from, because a lot of things are already in place, like workflow, that's already in place. You might need to fine tune it. But if you want to have like a simple out of the box solution, I think accelerators are a very, very good starting point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And if you weren't able to join us for our Q2 webinar about a month ago, I highly recommend going back to the portal to revisit that. Our Chief Customer Officer, Billy, did a live in demo of those accelerators. And yeah, it's incredible. So highly recommend you go check that out and see all of what Boris just talked about if you haven't already. Thank you, Boris. So for the next question, how often do you have a rollout on production? I'm guessing this is more towards the roadmap that you showed.
Yeah, so that's also a good question. So typically for initial implementation projects, we have a rollout only at the very end. So really after the UAT, only then you go live with let's say a big bang with all functionality at once. Although that go live might be then piloted first in one country or for one product group, but still you move the let's say the configuration all at once to the productive system. If you talk about phase 2 projects, that might be a little bit different. It depends then a little bit whether the phase 2 is really building on top of phase 1. So then you can go live theoretically per sprint. Although we don't very often do that. So typically we then go live with a group of sprints, then we have a kind of mini UAT and then a go live, and then maybe again 2 or 3 feature sprints, again a UAT and then a go live. But if a phase 2 project is adding another module, for example, then typically you only go live with that module once it's completely done. So it's a bit situational, I would say. So I hope that answers the question.
You. Yeah, in my opinion, it does. Yeah, thank you for that. That was great. And then the next question is, how are you delaying with refinement and who participates there?
So I'm not sure I understood the question. How are we? So
yeah,
what is this about the foundation sprint? How do we get all the requirements clear, or?
Yeah, I'm guessing so. Let's see, refinement for an upcoming sprint.
Yes. Okay, so maybe this is like the sprint, the grooming sessions, user story grooming sessions. So so in the foundation sprint, we added a lot of details to the user stories, trying to get them all complete already in the foundation sprint. But then the week before the sprint really starts, all the user stories that we moved into the next sprint, we need to make sure that the configuration engineer is really 100% sure that he fully understands it, and the configuration engineer should then also tell whether or not still some requirements are missing, and they need to be added then on the spot in the sprint planning session. And if we can't do that in the sprint planning session, the user story cannot be considered for the next sprint. So it needs then to move to the backlog, needs to be completed by the customer before it can go into the sprint.
Great, thank you. And then another question is, how long is the project scoping phase?
Yeah, so pre-sales, the high-level scoping pre-sales, yeah, that really depends from customer to customer, and also how long the sales cycle takes. But if you look at a foundation week, so very typically it's all done in 1 week. And let's say for smaller projects, it's then 1 to 2 man days. For larger projects, it can then be 3 till maybe 5 days. And important there is that you have then all the relevant people in one room together.
Great.
But that should be enough to get the scope complete. So we as PriceFx, we expect that customers already know what they want, and we are not like a strategic pricing partner that really is going to analyze their pricing processes and tell them how they should improve those. So we have partners to do so. So maybe the partners on this call can do that or will do that, but we are a software company. We expect customers to be able to tell us their requirements, and then basically we implement their requirements. And of course, we advise them how other customers do that and how you can best do that in our tool. But that's as far as it goes.
Thank you. And I appreciate you hitting really on the ecosystem and the fact that we have strategy partners to really, hone in on that project scoping phase, because we are a software company. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And then just a few more questions, because I would love to stay true to everyone's time. And if there's any remaining ones, we'll make sure to address those on a one-to-one off session after. So just a few more questions for us. Do you have a DOR and a DOD? If yes, what does done mean for you? I'm not too familiar with the DOR, DOD. I hope you are, Boris.
Yeah, so I think this refers to the definition of ready and the definition of done. And actually, we quite recently had internally a debate on that because different people have different definitions on what's ready, what's done. So initially we had the definition of ready, like we as PriceFx are ready with the user story. It's now up to the customer to test. And then when the customer tests the user story and says, well, it's approved, then the user story is done. But actually we stopped doing that, because if you look at pure agile, those definitions were a little bit different. And now we only have a definition of done, and that means that the user story is ready for the release. That's then done, and we don't have a definition of ready anymore in our methodology. But it's more like a terminology question and doesn't affect really how we handle things. But it's the same with our software. The simpler you keep it, the better it works, and the same with methodology. If you have a lot of definitions, then it can be very confusing to customers. You always have to explain it. So we also try to simplify our methodology as much as possible. So I also hope this answers the question.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Boris. Just a few more questions. And then, do you have any automatizations regarding testing or deployment?
Well, we don't have that for our projects. We do have that internally. So our engineering team does have automated testing. On the project side, we have not, but our QA team is looking into that to see whether we can automate that as well. But currently, we only have that in our engineering team.
Great, thank you. And then just one last question to kind of wrap things up. And like I said, if there's any other questions that we don't get to, I'll be sure to address those in a one-to-one situation after the webinar. So just to wrap things up, how long does a sprint planning take?
So a sprint planning meeting. So a sprint planning meeting, the meeting itself typically takes, let's say, 1 to 2 hours. But very often we have specific grooming sessions that then go into the details of user stories and refine them together with the solution architect and the customer. And we have them typically once a week, sometimes twice a week. And that can be a little bit longer meetings depending on the complexity of the user stories and how much detail still needs to be added. But the sprint planning meeting themselves typically take 1 or 2 hours, and you do that with a larger team. And the grooming sessions, typically it's then the solution matter experts on the customer side, maybe then the product owner, and then the solution architect on PriceFx side.
Wonderful. Anything else you would like?
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe I have one thing that I realized I didn't explain yet completely, and that's the expert services. So we just have, I think, 1 minute. So let me quickly explain what we have there. So basically, we have 2 expert services. So one is around solution design. And in that phase, we help partners with the first part of the project. So you can look at that at the project initiation, the foundation sprint, preparation sprint, and setup sprint. Because we see that phase as the most important phase of the project, because especially in the foundation sprint, where you detail out all the user stories, there you really lay the foundation for the success of the project. Because if you have there all details tackled, then the rest of the project goes smoother. And then the second package we have is solution guidance, and then we will help you and guide you through the feature sprints. So to make sure that during the feature sprints you have the proper cadence, you have in terms of delivery, internal testing, customer testing, and that you have that all properly documented. So those are the 2 main expert packages. So on the design side, so the front side, and then on the delivery side here during the feature sprints. So that's very high level what we have there.
And we'll definitely dive into that later in another partner webinar. And I just want to thank you so much, Boris, for delivering such a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it, and I hope the partners do as well. Like I said, this recording will be available via your email shortly after it concludes, as well on the Advantage PriceFx community portal. Please fill out the survey after to see, what topics you'd like to hear from more, as well as to see, what this topic meant to you and where you would like other areas to be expanded on. So thank you everyone for attending, and really appreciate Boris delivering such an excellent presentation. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all very much.